Hey guys, I am so excited for you to watch this episode. It's the last regular season episode of the year. So we always take the last 2 weeks of the year off. So this is the last one for 2024. It's so crazy that 3 years have gone by so fast. We're heading into our fourth season with Latter-day Disciples. And I'm so excited to be with you guys and for all the things that next year has in store. Before we start, just one last reminder, last call for donations for Secret Saviors. We've already sent off several gifts for the families. If you have anything in your budget that you're planning to give, please now is the time to do that. And then as well, I mentioned this on the episode last week, but we are doing our very first women's retreat at the end of February, February 22nd, 2025. It's going to be in Kaysville, Utah. We already have the venue. We have so many speakers lined up who are absolutely fantastic. Some of them are names that you know, some you don't. But the whole event is going to be dedicated to exploring some of the topics and consider yourself as Eve a little bit deeper and understanding how we as women can really embody our femininity. I know that that's one aspect of the book that maybe feels a little bit incomplete. And there's reasons for that because there's so much nuance to how do we actually embrace our femininity. But this is going to be a really awesome opportunity to dive into that exact topic and understand you yourself. What are some practices that you can incorporate? What are some perspectives that you can cultivate as well? That will really help you embrace your femininity. So look in the link for information about that and to know how to register. We hope to see you there. It's really going to be a fantastic event. Okay, that said, I'm going to turn the time over to this conversation with me and my friend Brooke Dalling, and I wish all of you and your families a very wonderful and Merry Christmas. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this special episode of the Latter-day Disciples podcast. We are continuing our book series that we are doing, going over each chapter of Consider Yourself as Eve, and just presenting some additional food for thought topics that are somewhat adjacent to the book itself, but also hit on some of the main themes. So today we are talking about chapter 8, which might possibly be my favorite chapter in the whole book. It's about the priestesshood. And I feel like this chapter just came kind of in a download to me. It was a lot of revelation and things that I hadn't ever thought about before or really recognized in so many words. And so it was really fun for me to learn these topics for myself. And I hope that these can be a blessing to other women and men who have the opportunity to read it as well. So in this chapter, we talk about, well, first off, we actually talk about priesthood. And we talk about what is an order of priests and what is the scriptural pattern of priesthood. How do men come into the priesthood and what is the stewardship there? And we use that to understand what the priestesshood is, because they are complementary and equal and opposite to each other, like the warp and the weft of a weave. And so that was really fun to talk about. We talk about how women are ordained to the priestesshood. And I'll just spoiler alert and say that we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But essentially, scripturally, we can see shadows of the fact that women are ordained from our birth. And that was a necessary part of us coming here and being able to fulfill our capacity, which is to give life in the pattern of our Heavenly Mother. And then this was really cool in talking about different callings and roles that we play in the priestesshood. We look at different scriptural archetypes that define 7 progressive callings, you could say, or roles in the priestesshood that align to our physical development and our spiritual development as well. We look at different women in the scriptures and what their characteristics were, what are some of the symbols behind them that tell us where they were in their own process of spiritual development, and what are their qualities and how do we embody those as well. We also talk about priestess quorums, which is coming together as women who are across the spectrum of all 7 of those different archetypes, coming together to bless one another and to do the work of giving life. And we look at some examples such as mothers and daughters, mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law, sisters, friends, all those sorts of things. And then the final section is about what it is to become a prophetess, what it means to receive Jesus Christ and experience the fullness of the sealing ordinance, the gift of grace associated with that being receiving Jesus Christ ourselves. So some really precious, sensitive things in that. We talk about Mary Magdalene, who is really a type of the whole process. So, all that being said, I'm really excited to be joined today by my friend, Brooke Dalling. Brooke hasn't been on the podcast before, but I have been wanting her to come on. So, I'm really grateful that she is here to join us today. Some of the insights from this chapter I feel like I got directly from Brooke. So, she was the perfect person to come and discuss these things with me. Brooke, would you mind giving us a quick introduction to yourself?
Sure. Yes, I'm Brooke Dalling. Thank you, Megan, for having me on. Um, so I was born in Utah, grew up, have come from a big family, a wonderful family of 8 children, and married. I have 4 kids, 1 boy, 3 girls, and I've always been I feel like I've always been very interested in the feminine, the divine feminine, and I've just kind of known that from my childhood. So as I've grown up, there's definitely times in my life where that has just become a little bit more evident of what like that yearning, hunger, interest was. Um, I know Megan from the Isaiah Institute. I'm part of the president of the Isaiah Institute, and so she's been great to work with us there, and that's how I met her. And I'm happy to be on here right now talking about this. What do you want? Did you want me to talk about what kind of led me to this?
Yeah, let's start about that because I feel like, my journey, some people know this, I've talked about this sometimes, that like my study of the divine feminine, I feel like is actually pretty recent. Like the last couple of years was really when I felt drawn to it. And I think that my friendship with you has played a really big role in that. Like you just helped me see how the feminine is so important and how the priestesshood in particular is so important for us to understand. But I'd love to hear a little bit more of your story. Like, when did the priestesshood come into your journey and like your spiritual education?
Okay, well, not until like I would say I've always thought, you know, when it comes to the priesthood, when you grow up in the church, I wouldn't say I'm like a feminist, but I've always felt like, um, what is that? What would it look like if there was like this total equality? And I've never thought I've wanted the priesthood. And I've always thought to myself, well, I want a priestesshood. I want,
Mhm.
I don't want to be with a bunch of priestly men. I want to be with priestess women.
Yes.
And so I had a lot of experiences that kind of turned me to the feminine more deeply. One of those was going on like a tour in England and Scotland that was about, Mary Magdalene and the Knights Templars, like Christ's traditions in Great Britain. And that helped me kind of gear my mind towards these things. That helped me read a lot of books on like Mary Magdalene and the Holy Grail. And of course, those are just like incredibly beautiful feminine stories. And then I had an experience in the temple that really kind of led me to think, okay, there's an order here. Like this isn't just like there is a priesthood order, there is a feminine order. And I saw that when, when we sit, men on this side, women on this side, and we're told men follow men, men follow Adam, women follow Eve. And I thought, okay, well, how can I show up in my life like that? And as I began to kind of ponder about that, I had this experience where, previous to this, I'll just add, there was a couple in my ward whose daughter had passed away, and she was a mother. She was probably, my age. Maybe she was like then in her 30s, and this both parents had got cancer, and both parents had overcome their cancer within the last like 5 years, and their daughter got cancer, and she passed away, leaving her young children. And this was so hard for them to bear that they, in their older age, would be able to overcome their cancer, be healed or cured, and that they would lose their child. And well, she was a mother, young mother. And they were really struggling with this. And we were talking about it in it was like a unique Sunday school class. It was one of those classes that are like the side classes. It was actually going through the 12-step program, which was super cool because you get to talk a little bit more intimately in those groups. And in this in this Sunday school class, the dad was talking about how painful this was, and how he was just crying like unto the Lord, saying like, why would you save me and not her? And he fell asleep, and he had this dream where he saw her on the other side teaching women, and how much she was needed there, and what that looked like. And he was just completely comforted by this, like, this lens of which he now saw what she was doing. And I like that kind of stuck with me, that okay, again, even on the other side, women are teaching women. And so what is this, right? What is this purpose? Like, is it just because women know how to teach women and you've got to keep men and women separate, or is there a little bit more to this? So maybe I'll just kind of just dive into this.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
this
wanna hear it.
experience that I had, which it's kind of a personal experience, but I'm willing to share it to kind of help makes when I read through Megan's book, I thought this came to me, and I thought, okay, this really lines up with a lot of what I'm seeing in the book, and this is what's so great about reading this chapter is I feel like Megan and I have had a lot of conversations, but there's so much in there that we haven't had conversation about, and what I feel the same way, or I was taught the same thing, or and not that it was actually written anywhere, just that it was inside me that I knew this.
Right. Can I highlight that really fast? Because I
Yeah.
think that that is a really like important thing to know about the priestesshood is that like you and I have had that experience where we're learning independently and then we share something with each other and it's like, "Oh my gosh, like that's really similar revelation to what I've had." And I just want to say that like I've experienced that with so many women. Like there are so many women right now that are feeling this pull and feeling this call to step into our role as a priestess, and it's very organic. It's happening very naturally, kind of on the grassroots level, like below the surface a lot of the times. And it's each individual woman just quietly in her own spiritual development is encountering these truths. And then if you have the opportunity to connect with other women, we're seeing that exact same phenomenon where it's like, oh my gosh, like I learned the same thing that you learned, but we both learned it totally independently. And I think that that's actually a really true pattern when it comes to the priestesshood. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out. Okay, go ahead.
And it's really important, like, to see it that way, because that's like the whole story of the priestesshood, right? So you begin your chapter by talking about where the priestesshood comes from. And like you kind of said, spoiler alert in the beginning, it we're born with it. So if you want to just tell me a little bit about in the book where you're coming from that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so this was a really interesting thing for me to kind of research because again, I think it was just sort of naturally in my own ponderings and studies and in my own revelation, I just felt like women like we're already a part of this. Like how did we get to be a part of this? Because it's very different from the priesthood. The priesthood is something that men have to qualify for and then be initiated in, and then they have to kind of prove themselves in that in order to ascend and gain like what we would call the higher priesthood and Melchizedek priesthood. I talk about that a little bit. Like the powers of that are very, very substantial, right? So that's the male way of doing it. And the feminine, I just felt so strongly like we don't have that. And is it because we don't need it? Is it because we're eventually going to do it the same way the men are doing it? Or is it because we are women and therefore the way that we are ordained is uniquely different? And I think that it kind of came out when I was studying Eve and her whole process in the garden where initially Adam was in this terrestrial plane and he hadn't fallen yet. And so because of that, he was able to, like, he had his male body, his masculine spirit were in alignment with one another. And we know that because he could do his stewardship. Like he was administering names, which you could see almost like a type of administering covenant to the animals and putting them in covenant with himself and with God. And so Adam was like jiving in the garden, like he could do exactly what he needed to do. And Eve was there and she was out of balance because she couldn't perform her stewardship, which is to give life physically or even spiritually. She was in an environment where like that just wasn't needed. And so when she partook of the fruit, what happened was she descended into the celestial sphere where she could perform her stewardship, and that put her body and her spirit in alignment, in balance with each other. And so when I looked at that, I was like, okay, well, Eve and Adam partaking of the fruit to me is a type of their birth. Like it's a symbolic birth where they came from a higher state and descended into this celestial state. And with that understanding, seeing that Eve, when she descended and was born basically into this celestial space, is when her body and spirit came into a balance with each other. That kind of set the light bulb off for me. And I was like, oh my goodness, I think that women are ordained from our birth. So I went to the scriptures and I have a whole bunch of examples. Ordained is a word that's used a lot more liberally in the scriptures than the way that we tend to use it traditionally, like in our faith. And there's all these different things that it says are ordained. And so many of them are just inherently feminine things, like to bring forth fruit, to the powers that be, being that feminine power as opposed to action, doing, being really the masculine. Strength out of the mouth of babes, which is just beautiful imagery. And so all these things in the scriptures we say are ordained, they're appointed, they are basically set forth by God to serve a particular purpose. And then most importantly, we learned that in 1 Corinthians 2, verse 7, it says, we speak of the wisdom of God in a mystery. And we know that wisdom is that feminine noun, is that name holder for Heavenly Mother. Wisdom, the wisdom of God in a mystery, even the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the world unto our glory. And so that just hit me. And it was like, oh my goodness, women, the divine feminine, we are ordained from before the foundation of the world. And when we are born into this life, we bring our ordination with us. And that's a mystery. That's been something that we haven't been consciously aware of. But again, these are the fullness of times. So all of these veils are beginning to be parted. And I think that we see many women who are waking up to this reality and saying, oh my goodness, I don't need to be ordained to anything. I already am. I already am ordained to the priestesshood.
Oh, I love that. See, this is so when I read the book and I was, hearing you say this, I was like, oh yes, this has been something that I have learned is also that this, waiting for some masculine structure to be able to ordain us. I never jived with that. I just was like, I don't know how that would work. This is
Yeah.
this is a men and women
Right.
different order. And so I would think it would make sense that this came from our mothers. And I knew, and I just kind of inherently knew that. And I really it came in touch to that with that through a really powerful meditation that I had. And then one time I was reading the prologue in the beginning.
Should we read it?
I think we should.
Okay.
It had this, there was this profound story in the beginning of it that really just sunk so deep into my bones that I was like, this is real. Like I just confirmed to me what I already suspected, but I loved the story of how it happened. So okay, should I just like read the prologue?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is their words, her words, not mine. Okay, so Shekinah, Shekinah. The word simply popped into my mind like an uninvited guest that wouldn't go away. At times it seemed to disappear, but then it would come again quietly. This strange word, Shekinah. It seemed to be waiting patiently for me to pay attention to it. After hearing it in my mind for 3 days, I tried saying it out loud. Shekinah. It had an interesting sound, and when I said it, I felt a soft tug somewhere deep inside. I began to ask my friends if they knew what it meant. It sounded as if it could be Hebrew, but although I knew some Hebrew, it was not familiar to me. When my husband and friend were unable to help, I tried the library in our small town, but found no answer there either. Shekinah, Shekinah. It was becoming more insistent now, demanding my attention. Still puzzling over what it could mean, I was sitting in my bedroom one morning when my friend Joan hurried through the doors. She strode across the room and thrust a book into my hands. Let's try this, she said. I glanced down at the blue cover of which the word Kabbalah was written, and turned to the index. Running my finger quickly down the S column, I read Shekinah, the feminine face of God. The words sent a shockwave rippling through my spine, and and goose flesh bristling on my bare arms, because I realized at once that the Shekinah was not an uninvited guest at all. She had been announced to me with great ceremony in a powerful dream a full month earlier. In the dream, I happily soar high above the clouds on a great golden dragon, until I wonder, is this all there is? The dragon immediately descends to earth, alighting at the sound of like a jewel-like temple, a large body of water. I went to the temple, but I'm afraid to go in. I turn back to the dragon, hoping it will come and protect me. But this temple is human-sized, and the dragon will not fit through the door. I begin to climb the stairs to the entranceway, and now see a ferocious temple guardian with bulging eyes looming menacingly in the doorwell. Black dogs snarling on either side of him. With an uncharacteristic bravery, I continue walking, and as I stride through the door, the guardian of his dog evaporate as if made of fog. Once I'm inside the doorway, an old man with long robes and white beard emerges from an inner hallway to greet me. Without actually speaking, he lets me know that his name is Melchizedek. He is wearing a handsome dagger with a handle of turquoise and jade. And as soon as I notice this, he presents me with a matching dagger, indicating that I am to wear it on my right side. Then he motions me ahead of him. It is clear that he expects me to lead the way. I step into the long hallway with a high ceiling and red tiles on the floor. Walking slowly, we eventually come to a pair of polished wooden doors. At the end of the corridor, I open them silently and lead the way into a large empty room. A plain wooden stage is set against the far wall. At the back of the stage is a built-in cabinet. I approach the cabinet and pull open the doors. I am dumbfounded by what I see. Rolled into a finely carved wooden poles is the most sacred object in Judaism, the Torah. I learned this as a child, that the Torah contains the 5 books of Moses written on parchment by an Orthodox scribe. And then if one letter has been written incorrectly, the Torah cannot be used. I have never actually seen a Torah close up or held one, since these privileges were permitted only to men when I was growing up. But now I lift the Torah carefully out of its cabinet and cradle it to me tenderly as if it was a baby. I noticed something unusual. Instead of a mantle of velvet covering the scrolls or a simple ribbon holding them close, the Torah has been sealed shut by a dark round blot of red wax. I look at Melchizedek. This is a very special Torah, he says. Pulling out his dagger, he breaks the seal and rolls open the scrolls, and they are absolutely blank. The Torah is empty, he says, because you need to know now. What you need to know now is not written in any book. You already contain that knowledge. It is unfolded from within you. What is this Torah for? I asked. My question seems to set in motion the next sequence of events. Without speaking, Melchizedek lifts the Torah and lightly places it inside my body. From my shoulder to my knees, I accept it gratefully, feeling my body as a sacred vessel. Once again, a great commotion breaks out behind us. Spinning around, I see that the room is now filled with long-bearded patriarchs wearing black coats and trousers. They're holding hands, laughing and singing jubilantly around the room. They pull me into their celebration. As I dance, I see Moses, King David, and King Solomon, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They too are dressed in black coats and trousers, dancing with heartfelt abandonment. That I catch their joy, and I am filled with it. Ecstatically, we whirl around the room laughing. I love that part. Finally, the dancing stops, and I ask, what is all this about? Melchizedek answers, we are celebrating because of you, a woman, have consented to accept full spiritual responsibility in your life. This is your initiation as one who will serve the planet. As I wonder what this means, he continues, and you are not the only one. Many women are now coming forward to lead the way. But who will be our teachers, I protest. You will be your teachers for each other. You will come together in circles and you will speak your truth to each other. This time has come for women to accept their spiritual responsibility for our planet. Will you help us? I asked the assembled patriarchs. We are your brothers, they answer. And with that, the entire room is flooded with an energy of indescribable kindness. I am absolutely confident in this moment that they are our brothers. I feel their love without any question, they then say, we have initiated you and we give you our wholehearted blessing. But we no longer know the way. Our way does not work anymore. You women must find a new way. So when I read this, I felt like I had this dream. And it was just like tapping into that. And I just felt, oh, like this is exactly the burning that I have inside me, that we as women are an internal vessel of scripture. Like it is written inside us. It is written in our DNA. And that is how we learn of this order, is by going in, by finding, going through the process in which we are fully embodied and fully enlightened. It's so somatic. And I didn't expect that initially, that we tend to kind of separate ourselves from our bodies through like trauma or stress or pain, but that we at some point in time need to completely be in aligned with our bodies. And when we go into our bodies, we are able to connect into this wisdom and this internal knowing of this priestesshood, this order, this how the scripture that is the feminine, and that all the answers are in there. You know, you think of like all the books that you could read to learn everything, and it's all inside us. It is all like there's just this library of all of humanity, all of time, and before and after, that is inside of us. So I loved that. And I loved that, you know, that's where you were brought as well, was with that idea that we're just like, you know, men. You think of the male anatomy, and it's on the outside, it's seen. It's that, and it's for women, it's on the inside, and it's not seen. It's hidden. It's the unknown. And so yes, so much to go there. But yeah, that's kind of when like all these light bulbs were kind of hitting for me, and I thought, okay, I want to know more about what I can learn inside myself.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, and these were truths that I feel like I mean, that when I'm writing this book was my process of learning a lot of that too, you know, and a lot of it goes back to chapter 3 where I talk about Eve and the natural woman, and this idea that like we are the chosen vessels that God has ordained and uses to bestow the light of Christ on our children, on all of humanity. And so we are the writers and the keepers of the books of life. And that is the role of a prophetess. If you go and study in Doctrine and Covenants, when it talks about the role of a prophet, one of the main things that you'll see that set the president of the church apart from others is their capacity to canonize and to make the external written, you know, standard work scripture and say, yes, this needs to be included or not. And women, we all do that in our capacity. And yes, it is through our embodiment. It's through our bodies that we learn how to access that light for ourselves and then also imprint that light on our children and on others, right? Like our interactions with each other. I love that story, that dream that that you shared, and this idea of the men saying, you know, we're your brothers and we're here to support you, but you women have to figure this out for yourselves. It's not going to be the same. And that's something that I noted too, women sitting on the left in the temple, men sitting on the right. And I love that you've taken it a step further to say, not only are we sitting on the left, but we continue to follow the women in front of us. So thank you so much for sharing that and bringing that up.
Yeah. One other point that I wanted to make was that when I was talking about being embodied and kind of having that becoming that internal vessel, I could see that for me, the trouble that women have in being embodied is when women are in their retroversion. So there's like a male retroversion, which the male retroversion would be like power and control, and the female retroversion is numbness. So when we're kind of out of our alignment, the result of that is numbness. And numbness it's kind of like the opposite of life, being alive, right? And you can't be in your body, right, when you feel numb. And so when we're kind of in our retroversion, where we're going backwards, we're kind of not moving and progressing, that's what it looks like for us. And I could see that was when we look at like the church or an institution, and we see that, or we're reading the scriptures even, and it talks about what it would look like with no life, like dead, dry bones. And then the opposite of that is, what is life giving? And water, right, is very feminine and very life giving. And that is kind of the essence of what the priestesshood is, right, is giving the water and the life back to humanity. And so being able to kind of make new and alive again. And especially when we're looking at the priesthood, it's without the kind of waters of the feminine, it will dry up. There will be no life there. And so this is why it's kind of so important for us to be talking about priestesshood, is what is it that we need to know about priestesshood that will be able to help us, come together in that like unity of what we both need. Because without us waking up to this call, without us going inside our bodies, out of numbness, we can't offer that love and life. The one part I love in the very beginning of that Maxine Hink book, right after that prologue, she says her definition, and I'm not repeating this verbatim. So, and it's the essence, what she says the priestesshood is the healing of mankind.
So
and
good.
Isn't that so powerful?
I get chills.
And I think, yeah, without us being in our role, it's death. It's a cycle of death, and it's a slow dying death. But that is not where we want to go, right?
So good. It reminds me, so at one point, so in the chapter, I do talk about quorums, right? Which is, again, this idea of women coming together, each of us with our unique gifts and in our own place in the priestesshood and the different roles that we're learning how to play. We come together and we teach one another and we uplift one another and we help heal our families, right? And one of the scriptural examples that I was led to is the idea of the 24 Lamanite daughters.
Yes,
in the Book of Mormon.
Part.
And well, what's so cool is that what happens is that they are out in the woods, in the forest with all these trees, which is a very divine feminine imagery, right? And they're singing and they're dancing. And that is a true type of the priestesshood. When you see women that are officiating in the priestesshood in the scriptures, they are singing and they are dancing. Miriam is another example of this.
Yes, I was just going to say Miriam,
Yes.
to bring life, to bring the water. And without her, the well dried up, right? It's the singing and the dancing. And that's what's so great about that dream that she had, was that the men were like inviting the feminine, right? By dancing like that. That's why I said I love that part, because what I have learned is dancing is so important. The body, moving that body, it is like that is in that quorum, like you're talking about in the book. And I envisioned that, when with the Lamanite women, I was like, oh yes.
And I think that that's such a beautiful example of what women are when we are alive, right? When we're out of that numbness, when we are fully in our heart and being willing to feel the joy and also the pain, right? Like they both come together, and we have to be willing to engage with both of those in order to be fully human, in order to be fully embodied. But I just love that example of women coming together and dancing and singing, and that this is an example of what it is when priestesses are combining and working together and bringing that life. And then what happens to the 24 Lamanite daughters? Well, eventually they make intercession on behalf of their husbands. They literally save their husbands' lives. And that's not just because they're pretty women. Like that's because they were officiating in an order of priestesses and they knew how to do that. And that's a type and shadow of something that's much greater.
Yes, there's this feminine being able to help save the men, and then there's like this reversal of, this is always how it works, right?
Right, exactly.
Well. But yeah, and when you look at them as well, you can kind of like take that into our own lives as all the things that we inherit that are like the bad things, the impure things. It's saying when they became one with those, with the wicked priests, right? And they save their lives by that. This is like our story, right? We have that inside ourselves where we have this beautiful pure light part that's passed down to us, and then we also have this like wounded part that's passed down inside of us. And this is the when we're in the role of the priestesshood is when healing can come to all of that part, where that story is that they save, if you put it into an individual part, right, that save that part of themselves and that society.
This is something I've seen so strongly as I've learned more about the priestesshood, is the deep generational healing that comes when women really claim our power that we have. And it's really nice when we have men that are, in that dream, men that are there and like, yes, we want you to do this. Like, that's really helpful. But regardless of whether or not we have that, when women stand up and say, you know what, I have power, I am ordained, I am a priestess, and I'm going to learn how to use that power, what results is the healing of ourselves and generations forwards and backwards. Like, it's, again, the books of life we inherit, exactly like what you're saying. We have bad storylines that are passed down to us, but we are the ones who can edit that out and say, you know what, that came to me, but it's not going to continue from me. Like, I'm going to do the deep soul repentance so that my ancestors and my children are free from that.
Right. And this is the idea of alchemy, right? Is that the priestesshood, in my opinion, what we are able to do in that healing is like an alchemic, alchemical,
alchemical,
alchemical, like healing through our innate abilities, our innate gifts, and we can do that inside ourselves. And I don't mean to jump to the end of the chapter because I know that we'll get here, but when you talk about Mary Magdalene's part, I loved the part where he says, and this is the, she goes through the different levels, right? I'm trying to look and see
her ascent vision. So what we're talking about here is we include, when we're talking about what it is to be a prophetess, I include the ascent vision of Mary Magdalene, which you can find in the Gospel of the Beloved Companion. But basically, it's a vision that Mary Magdalene had after the death, the crucifixion, and resurrection of Christ, where she encounters him, and she's going through this ascent where she has to pass these certain kind of assessments and grow in light and truth in order to ascend. So she goes through 5 boughs of this tree, and at each bough she has to pass a test to say, well, I reject ignorance and vanity and pride and all these things. And she is embodying more and more divine qualities like wisdom and understanding and honor and humility. And she gets past the 5th bough, and that's like where the deceiver is, right? Like,
right.
Yeah, the adversary. And then she goes to the 6th bough.
Yes. So read that part.
Then in the light above, I saw the 6th bough, the one that bore the fruit of power and healing. My master told me that when you truly have eaten of the fruit of the clarity and truth of yourself, then could you partake of the fruit of power and healing, the power to heal your own soul, and thereby make it ready to ascend to the 7th bough, where it would be filled by the fruits of light and goodness.
Oh, isn't that amazing? So good. Yes. So this is what I'm talking about.
I love it.
This is, I think that when we're in our full power, like this is the access part, is that when we are able to be able to heal ourselves, and in doing so, we don't heal all of mankind around us. Like we show them what healing looks like. We show them how to be healed. And granted, I think we will have some healing power with the priestesshood. Yes. But yes, I mean, I think it can look different than we imagined it that way.
Mm-hmm.
But
I love that.
Loved that part.
That's so good. Thank you. I take no credit for that. That's just the ascent version of Mary Magdalene. And I had to include the whole thing because I'm like, this is so beautiful. And it's such an amazing example of what growing in the priestesshood, I think, actually is. Like, this is the feminine version of ascent. We get a lot of the masculine in the scriptures and the hero's journey and all of that. And this is Mary Magdalene's experience. Like, before she had the power to heal herself, she had to partake of the fruit of the clarity and truth of yourself. And like, What an incredibly true thing for us to know as women too, that like so much of what stops us in stepping into the priestesshood and our own capacity is these lies that we accept about ourselves, that
Mm.
we are less than, that we don't have this power, that we're not divine beings that are incarnate in having a human experience right now. Like, and we have to get rid of that first. Like we have to have clarity and truth about who we really are, which is those beings of light that have condescended, that were willing to take on a female body, which is so hard. Like just that alone is such a challenge. But we have to, like, that's a part of our journey is overcoming those lies and embracing the truth, which is that we are daughters of God and we have all of the power that we need in order to go through this evolution and to bless literally all of humankind while we do it.
Yes, going through, beloved daughter, beloved bride, beloved, just going through all and claiming all of those parts of us. And, I've been listening to this great preacher who I find fascinating recently. His name is Damon Thompson. And have you ever heard of him?
Mm-mm.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think there's so many different takes on the garden story, right? With Adam
Yeah,
and Eve. And I love all of them because they all teach you something different. And I
it's true.
particularly loved yours in the beginning, pointing out, I actually hadn't thought about the fact before that Eve wasn't there when he was commanded not to. And I love that.
I didn't either. It was like, honestly, it was our friend Meredith. We're both of us are friends with Meredith. She was the one that was like, oh, yeah, Eve wasn't even created yet. And I was like, what? And I had to go look up
That's
all the
huge.
versions in the scriptures. I was like, oh my gosh, you're totally right. It was mind
Yeah,
blowing.
that's huge.
Yeah.
So I love that. But he brings up, he kind of was like this preacher that had this kind of born again experience into a totally different unorthodox religious way, into this like more like internal like rebirth, I guess.
Yeah.
And what kind of caused this pivotal moment for him was that when he was reading the story of Adam and Eve, he saw that the serpent was the one who said, if you need to partake of this so that you can become like the gods. And he says the
Mm.
only sin that he, in his kind of revelation of how it was like taught to him, was not believing that she already was. And it was like, oh, that's the veil, right? That's the
Mm.
veil that comes from the fruit, is forgetting actually who we were. And I know she needed to do that. This was all part of the plan.
Right.
But to think of it that way, that she already was
Mm.
like the gods. And
So good.
yeah, it is, so part of it is just like this remembering, like we're progressing through these stages, right? That like Mary Magdalene's talking about, but the ultimate end is knowing who the I am,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
And
Oh, so
that's
good. And it's this divine dichotomy too, right? Like this paradoxical thing where it's like, yes, we are in a state that's fallen right now. Like, we're not suggesting we don't need redemption, right? Like, Jesus Christ and his role is irreplaceable. But at the same time, like, we tend to focus on that so heavily, and we forget the other side of the puzzle, that is, we are part of God. Like, we are made from the same stuff.
yes, we
And
were created in his image. And
yes.
and this was before, it says before you were in your mother's womb, like I created you, right?
Yeah.
And he's not going to create something that isn't amazing and wonderful. And so this,
Literally, he can't. Literally, they can't, right? That's why
right,
Adam and Eve were in the garden, because God cannot create anything that isn't perfect.
right. It's
And
in
so
his
they had
image.
to fall. They had to
So
initiate that.
when it talks about in the book of Mary Magdalene, like how there is no sin, right? That,
Mm,
just a different take of it, right? Of what we determine sin is that sin is anything that isn't in alignment with truth and God.
yes.
And when we look at it that way, we see that, yeah, that was the original sin. The
Yeah.
original sin was to have this veil brought upon us where we forgot who we were. We weren't coming from
Mm,
we weren't coming from a lens of God. We were coming from a lens of the serpent that was telling us
yeah.
that we weren't God, that we
Yeah.
weren't like him. We weren't created in his image.
And to be so honest, like the more that I like move through this pattern, right, of in my own spiritual development, and I'm not that far along, right? Like we all have work to do. But like as I've been working through it and learning for myself, like that truth is so real. Like God wants us to know that we are a part of God. And that's part of why they love us so unconditionally, and how we can love them unconditionally is to see ourselves and everyone else as we are all part of God. Like we can't afford to hate ourselves because that's hating God, or hating
Yeah.
someone else. That's hating a part of God. Like we are literally the same. And Joseph Smith taught that. Like, oh, his final some of his final sermons before he died were just so like he was really getting into the best, beautiful truths. And it was so sad that he was killed when he was, because I just wonder what else he would have come and said and taught. But I love how he taught you are co-eternal with God. Like
Yeah.
we are as eternal as God. And so that's interesting. And we kind of have to think about that for a little bit, because we're like, okay, so what does that mean about God being our parents? Here we're like, well, my parents are older than me, right? But I think in the eternal realms, a parent is a role, and it has less to do with them birthing us like into existence, and more to do with the role that we play to each other. Anyway, that's kind of a tangent. But the point is we are just as eternal as God is, and we have the
Right.
same capacity that our heavenly parents have.
Yeah. If we're made from the material of God, that's what we are.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that is, if we forget that, we forget everything.
Yeah.
And reclaiming that, it's like, the scriptures are always these paradoxes, and it's always the first is the last, the last is the first. We're
Yes.
back to when we finally come to her ascension, it's back to the beginning of,
Right.
and this time you experienced it in the body, and that
Mhm.
sealing to Christ, to God, that union, that oneness with him is fulfilled even greater through the embodiment of that,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is why Eve was so brave to do
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
It's about.
So good. Love it. So, in talking about the priestesshood and some of the callings, right? Because we're looking for ways that the male priesthood, as we understand it, can inform what the priestesshood might look like. And so these roles and callings, what I was led to, are scriptural archetypes, where we can look and say, okay, there's these 7 different kind of categories of women that define where they are in their physical development, where they are in their spiritual development, and where they're going. And it is this progression over time. And so we work from a virgin, meaning a young girl, to a handmaid, a bride, a wife, a mother, a queen wife, and a queen mother. And there's 7 archetypes. And I didn't come up with this, guys, because it's way too cool. But anyway, um, when we were talking offline, Brooke was telling me about this experience that she had that I think goes, it's just another example of what we were talking about, that we can get totally independent revelation and then come together and be like, oh my gosh, being taught the same thing. So would you mind sharing your experience with us?
Yes. So yeah, I was going to talk about this experience in the beginning, but we had to cover a little bit of stuff before we got there. So thank you for going over those archetypes. And yeah, so when I was reading through Megan's chapter, this book, I remembered this experience that I'd had, that like I'd said in the beginning, introducing myself was really pivotal in understanding the women follow women, right? So I was with my husband. This was back in 2017. And I think, as a couple, we'd kind of had this like born again experience where both of us were just really like uh, impassioned for learning more and growing, kind of, and like you were saying before, where we're at on this level, on this spiritual ascension, it's like we're still, sometimes we're like, oh, I'm up here, and then you're down here, but it's like a spiral,
Yes.
right? So you're just learning at these different layers and levels, and you're kind of learning a lot of the same things, where I feel like so many times I'm like, God, I've already learned this lesson, and it's like, oh yeah, but I'm learning it on this spiral
Yes.
where it's just becoming more and more embodied in me, that lesson. But so I'm we went to the Salt Lake Temple, and of course I don't know what it's going to look like now. Probably way different, but I loved that in the Salt Lake Temple you really had all the different rooms and transitions that taught you so much more than just being able to be in 2 rooms. So I'm sitting in, you go from the creation room to the garden room, and I'm kind of just like, sitting there doing my thing. We're with my husband and some friends of mine, and all of a sudden, they say the men will follow Adam and the women will follow Eve into the lone and dreary world. Well, that doesn't sound like a really great invitation, but so in my mind, all of a sudden, I heard this voice say, "Will you follow me into the lone and dreary world?" And I thought, "Oh, whoa, yes." And then when I kind of just said, "Of course I will. Yes, that's, I'm going to go in there." I saw in this flash the entire condescension of women, the falling from these like glorious, perfect beings of light and going into this earth where they would have to endure all the atrocities that women have. And not that men hasn't had their own set, but death of children and husbands and rape and all the inequality and just being less strong, and being the weaker, I guess, the weaker physically, and just being, I just kind of saw it like all together, like all that women would endure, like all that heartache, all that pain, all that suffering. I saw it in a moment, like in a flash. And it was like, okay, now will you follow her there? And I thought, well, with a little bit more hesitation, but yes, I will follow her. And it really kind of weighed heavily on my heart when I was walking in there. I just kind of thought like, oh gosh, like what are all the things like as a woman that I've suffered, and even like what is my like Eckhart Tolle kind of talks about like the pain body, the female pain body, like that what we suffer, just like we're talking about those scriptures being passed down in our DNA. Also, so is like the entire pain body of the feminine, right? And so this is kind of like what I'm looking at. And I hadn't read that until later, but that really connected with me. Like, oh yeah, that's what I saw. Like I saw the whole pain body of the feminine pain body from then until now. And so I'm sitting in there and just really contemplating all those things. And then when it goes into going from the telestial room into the terrestrial room, it says, will you follow Eve again? And it was just, again, like this voice that said, will you follow her in Ascension? And I thought, well, yes, I would much rather follow her up those steps, up into Ascension. And I love how, in the temple, in the Salt Lake Temple, you got to see that, right? You got to see the ascension and the descension, and you're actually physically doing that. I think that's, like kind of in the Egyptian pyramids, like that, it's really kind of critical to be able to navigate where you're at in those different rooms. So it's sad that we don't have that now, but I love being able to have this experience where that was really important to me to see that. So then we go into the terrestrial room, and I'm really contemplating this women follow women. Like I'm following Eve. Like, how can I follow Eve? And I see that, women follow women all the way to the veil. And then there's a man behind the veil. And I thought, okay, like God, like why do women follow women all the way into this point? And I'm just kind of asking God these questions in my mind about who represents who and how. And all of a sudden next to me, I'm on the right of the left and the very end of the aisle, and I'm just kind of a couple rows back. And Mother Mary comes to me. So it's like Eve takes me to Mary, the mother, and she takes my hand and she takes me to the front, just a couple rows ahead. And she puts my hand in the hand of Mary Magdalene. And Mary Magdalene takes me to the front and she sits down in front of the front row, and I see that Christ is sitting there, and she begins to wash his feet. And when I all of a sudden I go from seeing this to kind of like being at her perspective, and I just feel like the love that she had for the Savior. Words can't express it, totally ineffable. But as I'm feeling that and seeing what she's doing, and I hear his words that say, this will be a memorial for her forever. And that basically, he was telling the disciples was, you think that this was a waste of money to put this, to anoint me with this expensive oil. But this is what it's about, right? this is what needs to happen right now. I need this. And so I saw in this is all in my mind, that she anoints him a king, the king of all of their creation, and that he needed her to do that. And that this is kind of what's told to me was, and this is what you're here to do, is to become these kings and queens. And we kind of see through, since then I've seen, so much of the feminine being the ones who anoint the kings, and why that is and how that is. And you kind of talk about it in that chapter a little bit here and there. We kind of gain the perspective of the birthright and how that works, right? And that how necessary that was for her to do that. And so after, this happens, Christ and Mary walk me to the veil, where there was Heavenly Father and Mother behind the veil. Union is one, just symbolizing in that man behind the veil, but that was the sacred union, and that was what this whole creation story was about. So when I was reading this, Megan and I were talking, and Megan, do you want to just kind of say like how we kind of pulled some of those together?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's so interesting to start with considering ourselves as Eve, right? Because and basically this whole experience that you have, I think is such an incredible outline of us following women who are more progressed than we are, and also becoming those women and turning around and helping those who are, our sisters, and that we're all working to ascend together. And it is this transition into each of the 7 archetypes. So Eve, if you think about her, like she started off as a virgin. Can you describe what virginal means? I love how we were talking about that before.
Yes. So, when we think about virgin, we're always thinking, oh, she was pure, she was clean, she was undefiled, sexual connotations, like you mentioned in the book. And I can't remember exactly, I can't reference this, but in my learning, I remember reading that the virginal space, that is kind of like this pure origin space inside the feminine, like inside of the womb, right? This is where like all of our feminine intelligence and wisdom comes from, is this virginal space. And it doesn't mean virginal as in pure, clean. It means it in as far as like not sin, dirty, whatever, sexual. It means original. So it's pure in that it's as it was in the most original form. So untainted by falsity, untainted by anything that wasn't the pureness of the truth of it. So not necessarily like dirty. And I think that really helps, especially since, sometimes we feel like that's something we need to overcome, is feeling like our female anatomy parts, like if that they are unclean, or that there's any sort of negative idea, like that we have to really, kind of move beyond that to the belief that like, yes, like every woman has this pure, virginal, original, untainted space of clarity, that we're the wisdom that we are learning from.
So good. Thank you. And we talked about that a little bit in my last episode too, of just knowing that women are like, that our sexuality is a part of our power, and that is a beautiful part of the feminine that we need to own and like have gratitude for, and learn how to express that and embody that aspect of ourselves. But yes, what you're talking about, I love, because when we are born, when you have that little newborn baby, this newly embodied spirit, like they are the spirit that is in them is connected to God in such a real way. Like our spirits are advanced beings. Like they're way more progressed than we are in our embodied state right now. And when a baby is born, like they are that. They are that higher, authentic, spiritual self. And it's only through the accumulation of years of lessons, of trauma, of pain, of conditioning, of programming, all these things that we kind of adopt and assimilate into ourselves, that become our ego and our personality as we're a child. Like those are the things that create separation between us and God. And like there's a reason why little children we're told to become as a little child because they are pure, they're undefiled, they're not defined by those experiences that they've had. And so I think the invitation here is to heal, right? And to become whole, as we were talking about earlier. So I love that definition. It's getting back to our original state, which is that highly ascended being. So Eve started that way, right? When she was in the garden, she was this pure daughter of God, and she didn't have any learning. She was completely innocent. And I think that that's a type of like that childlike virginal state. And then as we grow, we become a handmaid. And I talk about in the book that being a handmaid has a lot to do with asking questions and learning how to get answers and having more and more experiences with God. And you start to see Eve going through that transition too, where she sees the tree and she's like, huh, like that tree is really calling to me. But like I was told we can't partake of it. And I talk about in the book, I think that she got that from somewhere else, not God. She could have gotten it from Adam. I'm not sure. But there was something in her that said, oh, I'm not supposed to partake of it. But at the same time, intuitively, I know that I am, like that is my tree and that is my goal. And so she's in a handmaid state. And then she goes through a spiritual death and a spiritual rebirth. And in the telestial state, she and Adam are baptized and they receive the Holy Ghost. She becomes a bride. And then she is Adam's wife, and they know each other physically, intimately, and they start to have children. And so she's gone through these three or four initial priestesshood offices that I talk about in the book. So you were embodying that when you were going through the temple, and Eve was the one that was coaching you and like showing you this is how you grow, this is how we become, this is how we ascend. And then she handed you off to Mother Mary, who is the mother archetype, right? Like she is the mother of the Son of God. And she gives you to Mary Magdalene, who is the wife. And so, well, not just the wife, but she is a queen wife. She is an ascended
The
being.
queen, yes, which
Yes.
is exactly what was, happening in that moment. Was
Yes.
she was doing her um exalting of him as the king, choosing him as the king, right? Making
Yes.
him the king.
So, so beautiful. And then she is the one who takes you and takes you to the veil and into the presence of Heavenly Mother, who is the Queen Mother. So, anyway, I just love that. Like, we didn't talk about this at all before
Yes,
today. But what a beautiful experience that showed women following women and like us coaching each other and also us taking on each of those roles in our time and eventually having that aligned to our spiritual development, our spiritual ascension until we're reintroduced to God, our heavenly parents. Like, so amazing.
yes, I love that. And I think sometimes too, when we're looking at the archetypes, and you might have mentioned this in there, but it's hard to kind of reference like who's who, because when I think of Mary Mother, I'm like, oh yeah, she is a queen mother. She is.
Yes.
She has arrived in that station, but what she appearing as, right? So it's like you can
Right.
come in any of those stations. They may come back, and you're like, okay, I know that they're even in the scripture references I was noticing in the archetypes, you're like, I know that this person is actually more spiritually advanced, and then they're coming back to be that handmaiden, or they're,
Mm-hmm.
and so just, watching that, look at more as the role that they're playing right there, than
Yeah.
like, because actually we're all the fulfillment of the highest role, right?
Right. We all are. Well, and that's the goal, right? Is like in our spiritual development, we will become and we are all of those roles.
Right.
So, like it is kind of tricky. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, and I would say that Mary, the mother of Christ, I would use her even as a higher archetype. I just mentioned this super in passing in the book, but talking about that spiral staircase where it's like we go around and we learn on these lessons and then we go back and we're learning them again, but like there's a whole other layer of it. And the priestesshood works the same way. Like there's these 7 archetypes that you could see as like one spin on the spiral staircase, and then you start over again. And I would say that the 8th office is a virgin mother, right?
Mhm.
So we're
Yes.
starting again, but it's like a whole new level.
Recreation.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's what Mary
Recreating our
was.
whole new spiral. Yes.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I think, when we're in our lives, we'll see ourselves um, kind of move through some of these phases, and then we'll move back through them,
Yes.
even higher and cleaner, cleaner by just more pure. But,
Yes.
because I think a lot of times like this judgment, this is, when we were talking about in the end of the book that Mary Magdalene, like what's the first one that she has to overcome, right? judgment and wrath. And I thought, kind of coming back to this Mary Magdalene's ascension, because I think it's just so beautifully like what this priestesshood ascension is judgment of ourselves is probably where a lot of us get stuck, in that one place. Judgment of ourselves and others. And we know that when we're judging others, it's because we have judgment towards ourselves, right? They're just kind of always there hand in hand together.
We're always projecting. That's always
and then we're also experiencing wrath through that, because that is just like stuck. So we do get stuck, I think, a lot, especially as mothers, and we're constantly messing up. There's just like, we got to get past that one to be able to get to that like wisdom and understanding, right?
Yeah.
So,
and I love that. Can I talk a little bit? So I learned this just this week. I was working through an online class, and we were going over some like apocryphal Gnostic texts, and they were the teacher was talking about 7 manifestations of wrath. So this was really fascinating to me, because I think sometimes we read that and we're like, oh, like anger problems. Like I just need to get over my anger problems, right? And like, sure, that's probably part of it. But there's really a lot more. And I think that it defines that first bow is really about overcoming our ego, like overcoming the natural self. And she was talking about the 7 manifestations of wrath, which are darkness, craving, ignorance, lethal jealousy, enslavement to the body, intoxicated wisdom, and guileful wisdom.
oof,
Right?
that covers it. That
You're
covers
like,
a lot.
okay, so I'm below the first bow. That's where I am right now.
Yeah.
When I hear that, right? But like, I just wanted to point that out, because like that first step is it's so much, right? It's a lot, and it's going to take time for us to work with the Lord in overcoming those things in ourselves. But what is the fruit of that? Well, the first fruit is love and compassion. Like it's learning how to get into our heart space and be born again, become that little child that doesn't have that programming. That's just that pure, original, virginal state of ourselves. And then it's all up from there.
Oh, I love that. I love that. And two, I wanted to say lately I've had this idea of that's really come to me, like when I'm meditating, is that the yin and the yang, right? And it's the masculine and the feminine together, but at the core of the masculine is feminine, and at the core of the feminine is masculine. And how when she's going through these stages, right, all these different ascensions, there's a masculine part of us that we also have to heal. And I was looking at those words when it's like judgment and wrath, and wisdom and understanding, honor and humility. And I really saw them, strength and courage, as those are actually like a feminine and a masculine, power and healing. And I thought, okay, this is like us coming into full masculine and feminine alignment inside ourselves by going through these. And I was like, oh, that I didn't, I've read this before, but I hadn't really thought of it that way. We talk about how the curse of Eve is like jealousy, envy, and strife, right? Mm-hmm. This is, and kind of looking into like, well, okay, what's the feminine part of that? Like, even if you're just being like stereotyping, right?
Right.
What's the feminine part? What's the masculine part? And you can actually see that in all of those. Mm-hmm. And I thought, okay, well, not only do we have to heal our feminine, but we also have to heal our masculine, so that we can come in right alignment, who is hopefully healing their masculine and their feminine to come together.
That's so good. I love that. Yeah, I didn't notice that either, but I think you're totally right. And like, that's the pattern of the whole thing, right? Like that is the pattern of spiritual development. It's not that I am 100% feminine all the time. It's that I am feminine most of the time, and I'm masculine at the moments when it's appropriate. And I learn what that looks like and how to be discerning, and God helps with that. Like that transformation, learning what that feels like.
And learning what our toxic masculine looks like and our toxic feminine. And, inside ourselves, we have it. Mm-hmm. And we manifest that both. So it's like, okay, what part of this needs to heal?
This is how you know it's true, right? Is that it works on all the levels. Like it works on the most micro level all the way to the most macro. And it really does. Like all of this starts just internal in ourselves, of like, I have to balance those two sides of myself before I can even, before I'm really effective at doing the work of balancing with my spouse, with my community, with the world. And I think that that's the beauty of, the promises of this time that we live in, is that there will be people that are making that journey and that are successfully learning how to do that balance within themselves, so that when we come together, like there's a collaboration of like-minded people, and that's when Zion, or the bride, comes.
Right.
Yeah.
So what's funny is my husband, every time we go to the temple or talk about the temple, he always emphasizes the part where it says, consider yourselves Adam and Eve. And so he's always saying, I'm like, we're talking about considering ourselves Eve, but he always reminds me like that we have a masculine and a feminine part. And what is, we also have to look at, consider yourself for the men, what's their feminine Eve, and what's that look like? And for us, what's our Adam part,
Yeah.
So it's kind
That's
of an
good.
interesting way to consider. That's the way it's stated. Consider yourself Adam and Eve.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So true. Oh, that's so good. Well, this has been so fun. Like, such a fun. I love this chapter. Like, if this was the only chapter of the book, I felt like for me, it was so worth it, because again, I don't feel like I wrote it. I feel like it just came, and so powerful. Like, these truths are so important. And I'm so excited for women to, for myself and for you and for so many other women I know who are learning these things and really starting to step into that authority that we have that's so divine. And I appreciate the men who are really open to that too, and that are figuring that out for themselves and making room. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about?
No, I love that. I think, just the importance, we talked a little bit about the quorum, but of women working together, and how, in the book, you talked about the honeycomb, and that, in this meditation that I had, and had been asking to see everything. I just said, okay,
Right?
Heavenly
Me
Mother,
too.
listen, there's just a lot of crazy stuff when it comes to divine feminine. You're just like, oh my goodness, this
Yes.
is why everybody's like keeping you on this really narrow line, because they're like, don't go that way, don't go that way, don't go that way, and there's just no information at all. And I was just getting really frustrated, and I'm like, okay, I know this is inside me. I just want you to show me everything, just show me who you are, what this looks like. I want it to be just the highest form of what this feminine looks like. And it's like, she kind of laughed at me. I in my meditation, she did.
I've
She
had
laughed at
moments
me.
like that
And she's
where I
like,
say things and God laughs, and I'm like, oh, yeah.
yes. So I see this gold octagon shape in my mind, and it was just so beautiful, this like radiating light of gold. And she says, this is what I will show you. And then I thought, well, that's beautiful. Like, you're gonna show, is it all right there? You're gonna show me this?
Is that
And then
everything?
it was like, then it just kind of like went outward, and I saw all of like these honeycomb combs all connected. And she said, I will show you this, and I will show your sister this, and I will show this other sister this and this. And they were all lighting up around me. And I could just see they all made the honeycomb. And she wasn't going to show everybody everything. She was going to show us parts so that we could come together and have a whole. And so I love like writing this book, talking about this, all these things. That's what this is. This is creating that comb together. And this is how we see her, and this is how we know her and her work. In that same meditation, I said, okay, I want to see your face. Like, please show me your face. I mean, I was really bold this time, I think, more than I must have been pretty desperate on this day, but and I was just pleading with her, like, I just want to see you. And I saw all of the women who love me in my life. I mean, it like started at like birth, and it went to like Mary Miss leaders, like, it was all these women in my life that had been placed there, friends, sisters, and teachers. And I just saw, like, it was so beautiful that her face in all of them. And she's like, this is what I look like, and this is back to this, like, the divine inside each of us. Like, she is in each of us her DNA, this is encapsulated in all of us. Like she is manifested through each of us, and as we work together, like we get to see her whole plan. So I'm so glad that you wrote this. And
I'm so glad that I could cite you and tell that analogy, because it's seriously so beautiful and so true. And it's something else I learned too, like in Isaiah, there's a lot of very deeply hidden feminine things in
oh
Isaiah.
yes,
He preserved it.
Isaiah is actually quite feminine,
Yeah.
and like
Yeah.
in the chaos wilderness kind of
Yes.
way.
Which is the feminine, guys. When people are in the wilderness, that's the feminine. Okay. Everything is crazy. But there was a part that I was talking about with Dave Butler. He was helping edit the book. And I think he read that part where I talked about your experience and the honeycomb and the beehive, and that we all have just this one piece of the beehive and we're supposed to come together and assemble it together. And he pointed out that in Isaiah, there's a reference there that the word, it's not translated this way in the King James Version, but in the Hebrew, you could translate it as beehive. And it was this beautiful reference to the feminine side of things. And so, like, I
Oh
didn't know that. I don't think you knew that, but like,
no, I
there's a
didn't know
real
that.
truth there. Yeah, it was
Yeah,
really, really
since
incredible.
then I've seen a lot of scriptural, like Robert Kay had a connection to the honeycomb, and Deborah,
Yeah.
like the name.
Deborah, yeah, the
Yes, and there's
prophetess.
just so
Yes.
many feminine, beautiful parts of the
Yeah.
honeycomb. Like, oh, no wonder this is a representative of that.
Right. And in the Book of Mormon, they
Um,
go into the wilderness and they take bees and honey. They always do. Like
yes,
it's always that symbol of taking the
and
feminine.
I don't know, I can't reference where I heard this, but there's this tradition in our culture of Brigham Young telling, when they came across from the east to Utah, that the young women each had a beehive, and that they
Wow.
were charged with bringing it into the Salt Lake Valley so that they could, give life to wherever they.
Right.
And I thought,
Right.
I need to find that reference, but this is where a lot of that, like, the young women being beehives, like, actually comes
Yes.
from that. So yeah, it's beautiful.
So beautiful. So beautiful. It's so great. Brooke, thank you so much. You shared such beautiful truths. Like, my heart is so touched. And I hope that this is meaningful for the women and the men who listen to it. Like, we have so much power. We have so much going for us. We're all just figuring this out. We're all leaning into our own honeycomb. But the time is coming where the Lord is going to say, okay, start to talk to your sisters and learn from each other. And I love that experience that you had with asking Heavenly Mother what you look like and I see my sister and I see my mom and I see my best friend, and we all have a piece of her inside of us. And I think that the priestesshood is the realization of that and stepping into that, leaning into it and saying, this is who we are and this is what we're here to do. And guess what? We're going to do it. So thank
Oh,
you
I
so
love it.
much. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.